All right, we have talked now several different sessions on a number of different topics. I hope you're starting to see that we're starting to pull the threads together. This is another one of those key links to understand the disease and the disease cycle of various landscape plants and garden plants for that matter. So I'm hoping that as we work our way through today's class that we will be able to take the pieces of a puzzle and stick it into the giant picture so that when we finish up this class and complete the applied learning experience, that we will be able to see the broad picture of how plants grow and deal with the conditions of the desert. So what we're going to start today, just looking at some of the overview of the factors causing the decline and death of plants. Now, I know that sounds ominous, but we're going to look at the big picture today. Today is the big picture. And then we're going to start going from the general to the specific. But we want to start with a general overview first.
Would it be possible?
And let's start with this picture here.
Would it be possible for you to move the papaya tree?
Yeah, the papaya tree.
Not
That's
the
the picture.
This, move the papaya tree.
No, this one right here.
I'm sorry.
This one.
I
I was going to say, you really don't expect me to move that tree off that slide, do you?
Thank you.
Yeah, and then, could you move the palm a little?
I don't think I can move the palm tree in this slide. No. But let's start with this tree here and introduce the process of diagnosis. Let's introduce the process of diagnosis and trying to decide whether or not this tree has died because of a disease or some other factor. So where do we start? The first thing to do is to identify the plant. Anybody have an idea of what kind of tree this plant might be?
It's got a big trunk.
It's got a big trunk. Absolutely. Here's a rope ladder. That ladder rung is about 1 foot. So you just kind of line those up around there. You can see how many feet. All right. Just one side of that trunk is a huge tree. Obviously has been there for a long time.
Eucalyptus.
Okay? Anybody know what it is? This is one of those red gum eucalyptus trees. It's a eucalyptus. There's not a lot that bothers eucalyptus in Arizona. Not a lot that they take drought, they take wet, they don't have a lot of diseases, they don't take a lot of fertilizer to grow. They do take some water. Water-stressed eucalyptus trees will survive. They don't look very good, but they will survive for a long time without water. So, when we look at a eucalyptus tree of this size, and we see the foliage drying up and clinging to the tree, while all the other trees around it are doing fine, it starts us to ask questions. What would be causing this kind of a problem? Is it an insect? Is it a disease? Is it a soil problem? Is it an environmental condition like a freeze or a frost or a hot summer? All those questions start coming up, and as we move into the lecture on diagnoses, we'll look at each of those questions in depth. Today we're going to simply focus on the potential for diseases. I want you to understand that this tree is not achieving its genetic capacity for success. Something has caused the genetics of that plant to be overcome in the environment that it's growing.
Genetic, what'd you say?
Capacity.
Capacity.
So we're going to define then a disease in a number of different ways. But before we go into the actual definition of a disease and what causes a disease, I got to tell you that there are various incidents of time in the history of the world where plant diseases have had a huge impact. Every course in plant pathology that I've ever taken, which are several, we always go back and talk about the impact of diseases, just so that we can understand that. If I didn't tell you today about the impacts of these particular diseases, they probably would take away my plant pathology identification card. So I'm going to spend some time talking to you about this, just in brief. Late 1845, Ireland, potatoes. The Irish potato famine. Where are potatoes native?
Were they native? They came from America, no?
Yeah. Where in America did the potato originate?
Idaho.
No, not Idaho. No.
Central America?
Where are they native? Where did they come from?
Mexico. Central America?
Further south.
South Colombia?
South America.
South America.
It was an Inca and relations staple. The Inca would conquer the continent on the backs of freeze-dried potatoes. It's native of South America, native to the Andes. They would grow the potatoes and they would freeze-dry them. Any idea how they would do that?
Wait till it snows.
They just throw them out on the rocks. It's a very dry climate. It's a very cold climate. So they just throw them out on rocks, and they would freeze, and then they would thaw, and then the cells would break down, and the water would evaporate, and over a period of time, it was a very nutritious and very lightweight food supply.
Potato chips.
How did it get to Ireland?
The first colony that was brought over. Didn't it go to France first?
I'm not exactly sure about the translation, but it was taken by the Spanish
Okay.
somewhere to Europe. My guess is it probably went to Spain or perhaps to Italy, but from a single focal point, it spread throughout. It's a great crop. It's a great food material, absolutely. And the Irish adopted it. In fact, it became almost a food staple. And it worked very well until some sneaky enemy of the plant called Phytophthora took out the entire crop. And in the process, they didn't have any food, and many people died, and there was a mass exodus from the island of Ireland. And so we find the Irish all over the world. There were people from Ireland who were fighting in the Mexican Revolution against Spain. There were Irish policemen in New York City. There were Irishmen who built railroads across this continent. All because of a potato and a microscopic fungus that took it out. Chestnut blight in the eastern United States in 1800s pretty much wiped out the chestnut trees on the East Coast. Dutch elm disease today, ceratocystis is a major problem. We are losing a lot of Dutch elms in the eastern part of the country. I did want to focus a little bit on the botrytis problem in France. Botrytis is a major disease of grapes, and France prided and continues to pride itself on its French wines. Botrytis, taking out the plants, causing dieback of the wood, the fruiting wood, seriously cut into the ability of that nation to produce wines. So they were struggling with it. And all of a sudden in southwestern, France, in the Bordeaux area, was a heavy manufacturing area. And one of the byproducts was copper sulfate. And they would haul it off and dispose of it someplace. Well, one day they were driving past a vineyard, from the story that I heard, and the wind was blowing, and it blew copper sulfate dust onto the vines, and somebody noticed that
The vines are doing better.
the vines did better because of it. And so today, Bordeaux powder, copper sulfate, is often seen on the shelves as a fungicide.
They
Copper
also-
sulfate,
they
Bordeaux
also
powder,
use the-
came from this particular experience here. So I just want to use these examples as places of where diseases have made an impact in the lives of people.
But the second impact to your botrytis is also, because they call it, the French call it the noble rot. They turn around and they use it in making wine, especially after dinner wine. And it's a big market. So actually now they actually are putting that botrytis mold into some of their plants to produce that after dinner drink.
There are options for a lot of the entrepreneurs, aren't there? So let's go ahead and realize that these diseases and others can have major impacts. We don't see a lot of diseases in Arizona. There are some, but we don't see a lot. I had a friend who was a plant pathologist a couple of decades ago here in Arizona. He came in with a lot of enthusiasm, and he spent about 3 years here and says, I'm out of here. I'm going back to where there are diseases. I said, we've got plant diseases here, Steve. And he says, yes, but they're all very difficult to work on. I'm going to go back to Texas or Georgia or wherever it's moist where I can have an impact. And that's true, and that's good from a standpoint that we don't have a lot of disease pressure in Arizona, especially southern Arizona. But on the other hand, the diseases that we do have to deal with, like cotton root rot, like root knot nematodes, can have a major impact on the plants that we grow. Let's define a disease. Let's come back to that genetic makeup that we were talking about earlier. A diseased plant is one which is incapable of carrying out its normal physiological functions: growth, development, reproduction, to the best of its genetic ability. All of us have you and I have a certain sequence of genetic material that makes us distinctly us. And we look around the room and we're all different. But we're also all the same. And within our bodies, we have the capacity to grow and develop and do the things of life that allow us to be who we are. It's the same thing in the plant kingdom. Each plant has a unique set of genes that put it in a certain family, put it in a certain genus, and has a certain species that makes it unique to other plants around. And even within the species, there's genetic variability. So the capacity to achieve our full life functions is a part of our genetic ability. Same thing with a plant. So we would expect a plant to be perfectly healthy if it's living up to its genetic capacity, if it's doing its thing. A diseased plant, on the other hand, is one that is limited in some way by something to prevent it from living up to and fulfilling its genetic capacity. Make sense? So, with that definition then, we can think about all kinds of things that limit a plant's genetic capacity. Could be an insect, could be a disease, bacteria or fungus. It could be freezing or too much heat, or it could be soil problems. That's why we spent so much time early on in this sequence of classes talking about the rules of botany, talking about soils, talking about water application and the rules that govern that. We've talked about a lot of different topics, all of which impact or describe the impact of a plant's capacity to live up to its genetic makeup. As we begin the process of learning how to diagnose and treat plant problems, we must not be limited in our thinking. We must not look through a knothole in the fence and say we have a 360-degree view. We must not eliminate out of hand any factor, because what we think might be an insect or what might be a disease, in reality could be something behind us that we're not looking at. Genetic ability and a plant's capacity to accomplish that. We can simplify that definition by just saying anything that causes abnormal growth in a plant could be a disease. Anything that's abnormal. And sometimes abnormal is hard to define. Because there's a lot of things that are normal that look abnormal. The spore reproductive structures on the bottom side of a fern leaf. The fuzziness that grows on a palm leaf are all normal. Yet occasionally we'll have people bring in samples and say, this is abnormal. So sometimes it's hard to tell what abnormal really is. There are several causes of plant diseases. And listed above are the infectious organisms, living things that can cause disease, which is what we normally think of. You and I go to the doctor and we say, I've got a virus, or I got a bacterial infection. Sometimes we go to the doctor and we have a broken leg, which has absolutely nothing to do with infectious organisms. It could simply be an injury, like a bumper of a car running over the tree, or it could be an unfavorable growing condition of some kind. These are all infectious organisms that can cause diseases in plants, and these are some of the unfavorable growing conditions or environmental conditions. We would call these biological, and these would be non-biological. And sometimes in the literature you may encounter the words biotic, B-I-O-T-I-C, and others may be abiotic or not biological. Biotic and abiotic. Sometimes we see that in the literature. There are certain conditions that must occur in order for a disease to grow and flourish. Number one, there has to be an availability of a susceptible host plant. The plant has to be susceptible in order for a disease to grow. I don't worry too much about the German measles anymore because I had them once. They tell me I'm immune. I don't worry about smallpox. Well, it's been eradicated, but on the other hand, I never worried about smallpox because I've got a scar on my arm. Most of us, maybe you're all too young to have that.
Got it.
I don't worry about a lot of diseases that other people have because for some reason they don't seem to affect me. But on the other hand, I may have a series of diseases in my body that nobody else will have. We have to be susceptible in order for that disease to flourish, to grow, and develop. And there are some plants that tend to be resistant to some diseases. For example, citrus has some resistance to cotton root rot. Has some resistance to it. It'll grow when everything else around it is dying from the disease. Next, there has to be the correct environmental condition. There has to be the right conditions for that to grow. If I'm consistently washing my hands during the flu season, it greatly reduces my opportunity to have that disease because I am creating an environment in one of the major ways for that disease to move by washing my hands. We don't see a lot of foliar bacterial diseases in Arizona because we have a dry climate. It requires a moist and a warm climate for it to grow. In Arizona, we don't have a lot of that. That's why my friend moved to Texas, East Texas, because it was more humid and therefore there were more diseases. The final condition that has to be present is that there has to be the presence of the disease organism. The disease has to be present. If I've got a susceptible plant and I've got perfect environmental conditions, if that pathogen is not present, I'm not going to see the disease. So one of the things that we try to do in growing plants is to break this chain, this cycle. If I can eliminate one of the three as a possibility, I've broken the disease cycle. So if I plant a non-susceptible plant, a citrus tree in root rot ground, for example, I've pretty much have broken the cycle. It's not going to be a problem. If I can eliminate a disease organism in the presence of a susceptible tree, I'm going to eliminate the potential for that disease, or at least reduce it. For example, Alternaria fungi in navel oranges. If I practice good sanitation and take all the diseased oranges off the tree and off the ground and dispose of them, I have reduced the amount of spores, the reproductive parts of the fungus, that can be in the environment and infect other fruit. I can break the disease cycle by knowing the weak parts and the places where I can have influence. These are the conditions. We often call this the disease cycle. We need to also understand this concept of sign and symptom. Signs and symptoms. A sign is when we actually see the disease organism on the tree, or on the shrub, or on the bedding plant, or on the turf. We actually have to see. If we see the fungus, then we know that we have that disease. A fungus oftentimes, even though it's microscopic in its simpler forms, will form reproductive structures. This is a fruiting structure. We call it a conch, C-O-N-K, that has little dots on the bottom, little holes, little pin-sized holes on the bottom. That's where the spores come out, the reproductive parts. So this sits in the tree like this. This part comes out of the trunk, and when it's time, it just releases the spores, and they blow away looking for another place where there is a susceptible host. This is a sign, because I can actually see the fungus. How is that made up, you say? Well, there's strands, and they all come together with their genetic capacity. They intertwine and form this fruiting structure. Most people think a fungus is very simple in its makeup. But when you start seeing this kind of a structure, you begin to realize that they have some complexities that oftentimes we don't see. This would be a fruiting structure on a type of a fungus. Usually a heart rot fungus causes this.
On what kind of tree?
I'm sorry?
What kind of tree would be the host of that?
Usually broadleaves. I rarely see them. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen one on a monocot tree, like a palm tree. But on broadleaves are very common. Elms, ashes, oaks, oftentimes will have those kinds of things. A symptom, on the other hand, is the plant's response to the disease organism. The disease organism causes some kind of a response. And the tree or the shrub or the bedding plant or the turf plant responds to that and puts out a series of symptoms. Both are very useful in diagnosing plant diseases, both signs and symptoms. So we always want to see the thing that's causing it. That's the easiest way to identify. So we're always, when we're looking at a sample or looking at a specimen, we're always trying to find the sign of the disease organism. But sometimes all we're going to get are symptoms. The problem with that is that there are symptoms that develop that look the same, but caused by different pathogens, different effects. So yellowing of the leaf could be saltburn, or it could be iron chlorosis, or it could be insect feeding, or it could be a virus disease, depending upon the pattern. So somebody calls us on the telephone and says, "Rick, I've got yellow leaves." Well, that's a symptom, but it doesn't tell me much about background. However, if somebody brings in a fruiting conch, I pretty much have got that diagnosis nailed, don't I? Oh, we like symptoms, but they're so complex, and there are so many symptoms that are caused by different organisms that we really have to do a better job of getting information. This is a bacterial disease on oleander called oleander gall. Here's a better example. Oleander gall is a response of the plant to the presence of the bacteria. It causes a symptom that we call a gall, and it comes out of the buds, out of the nodes, and there will be this abnormal growth. When we see that kind of a symptom growing on oleander, we pretty much know that that's about the only symptom that's going to be caused by that particular disease. So we pretty much know that that plant is infected with a bacterium called the oleander gall. Signs and symptoms. So let's take a look at the steps in infectious disease. How does a disease organism invade and overwhelm the defenses of a plant? First, there has to be inoculation. Inoculation means that the pathogen must come in contact with a susceptible host. It has to be in contact. I am not going to get a cold unless the cold virus gets inside of me. That usually is through the nose or the mouth. If I walk around with a mask on every day, and I wash my hands and sterilize them every day before I put anything in my mouth, then I'm going to have very little chance of getting a cold. But what do we do during the day? And part of normal living. Oh, I grab a fruit or a cookie and I eat it. Or I rub my nose. Or I suck my, no, I don't suck my thumb. Right? If I don't do those kinds of things, then I don't get the disease. There has to be this inoculation. The disease organism has to be able to get inside the susceptible host. The next step is that there has to be incubation. That means that the disease organism must grow and respond to being inside of the host plant. It has to be able to wake up from however it traveled from one place to another and start to do its genetic thing. It has to respond. We call that incubation. And it takes a period of time for incubation to take care of. Then it must penetrate. It's either got to get inside the plant or it's got to be carried in some way. It has to get inside. So let's take a look at, say, powdery mildew fungus, which is a common leaf disease on roses and other landscape plants. So the spore, the fruiting part, blows in the wind, comes in contact with the leaf, and lies on the leaf somehow. It doesn't fall off, it gets stuck to it somehow. It realizes that it has come in contact with a susceptible host, and so it starts to respond. Usually it is some kind of a biochemical pathway. There's something in the chemistry, the biology of that organism that responds to that susceptible host. Once and that particular disease is on top, it doesn't go inside, it just sticks its roots would not be the right, it's kind of like a root, but some kind of a structure down into the cell so that they can draw out the strength of that cell, of that plant, water and nutrients, and then it begins to, so it has to penetrate. It either goes through the stomates or forces its way between the cell walls or penetrates the cell wall itself to get into the cell. There has to be some way of it getting inside and getting a source of strength, penetration. And then there is this process of infection, the process of infection. I am successful, says the spore, says the fungus, says the disease, says the virus. I am successful. I got past the defenses, and now I am going to move forward. Any one of those places in there, the pathogen can be shut down. In our bodies, there are blood cells, white blood cells, that attack foreign invading particles. And if they can keep ahead of it, the disease never happens. We might have a virus in our body, and it may be moving through our blood. There may be infection, but if the defenses of the body can overcome that, we never see the signs or the symptoms of that disease. Same thing in a plant. And then we see the full-blown disease. We see the disease, sign or symptom that it takes place. Again, anywhere along there, we could see success by the plant or the animal of overcoming that kind of a problem. Each one of those steps has to occur. So how do we control them? We're going to spend a little bit more time on these. Number one is we can avoid them. We can avoid the plants, avoid the disease. Number two, we can exclude it. You say, what's the difference? Well, we'll talk about that. We can eradicate the disease organism. That's very difficult to do. We can protect the plant against the disease using fungicides. We can use this idea of resistant plants. Use plants that are resistant to the diseases. Plant those instead of susceptible ones. Practice good sanitation and apply therapy if it's indicated. Before we go into each one of those and look at them in depth, there's some general considerations that we must remember. Number one is that by the time the symptoms appear, the pathogen is usually already inside the host plant and is relatively safe from anything we can do. Once it's inside the plant, it's pretty tough to turn it around. Once it's inside the plant is pretty much on its own, sink or swim. Number two, most control methods must occur before it actually gets inside the plant. Control methods have to be applied before it gets into the plant. I can't wait until I see the symptom or the sign before I begin to apply protection of some kind. Got to do it early. The overall principle in effective disease control is to keep the inoculum, that is the number of particles that cause the disease, whether it's a virus or bacteria or fungus, to keep the inoculum density of the pathogen at very low levels. There's no disease that just one particle of the disease is going to destroy the host plant. Just not that, they're just not that way. Even the most virulent of the diseases that affect humans don't work that way. If we can keep the inoculum, the number of virus or bacteria or fungus fruiting structures low, then we have accomplished usually our design to protect the plant. These are general considerations that we must always keep in the back of our mind. So let's talk a little bit about each one of those areas and try to draw some distinction between them. Now, you are going to see, these are suggestions here listed for each one of the control options. We may see use disease-free stock in another one also. So you may see these in other slides and other techniques that we might use. But it's important, I think, to understand that these are all very closely related. So, number one, if I want to avoid a particular disease, I choose a geographic area where the disease does not exist. Pecan scab is a major disease in the pecan orchards in Georgia and Alabama. It's huge. It affects the outside husk of the nut, causes the husk to dry up, and that husk is what's nurturing the little developing nut inside. And if they get a lot of scab on a pecan husk, it will affect the quality or even whether or not the kernel develops. They sometimes have to apply half a dozen or more applications of fungicide starting very early in the process to keep scab from affecting the pecan. In Arizona, pecan scab is virtually unheard of. Nobody applies fungicide for pecan scab in Arizona. Sometimes the producers in Georgia say, unfair. But there are other things that affect the quality and the price of nuts in Arizona. For example, the cost of water. In Georgia, it's all pretty easy. It all comes from the sky. But In Arizona, we have to pay big bucks for every acre foot that we use. I can plant at a time when the environmental conditions do not favor the disease. Pumpkin or squash growth is affected by the influence of the whitefly insect. When a whitefly feeds on a susceptible plant, it injects saliva into the host plant in order to break down the structure so it's easier to suck up the goodies from inside the plant. It's very difficult to suck a strawberry or a cherry up through a milkshake straw. The straw gets clogged up. So the insect injects the saliva to keep those kinds of problems from happening. In the process, when a pumpkin leaf is affected by this saliva, when it happens, then it starts to turn a certain color. A symptom develops called silver leaf. The leaf, I'm not talking about the normal silver bars that we see on a squash plant leaf. That's not what I'm talking about. The entire leaf will take on a silver sheen. And in the process, it loses its full capacity to photosynthesize, and the fruit is affected by it. It affects the plant's ability to produce a sizable fruit. And so, if we're going to grow pumpkins in southern Arizona, Pinal County, Santan Valley, let's be specific, for Halloween, we can't plant in July like everybody else does. Everybody else plants in July and harvests at Halloween. But July and August and September are the peak months for whiteflies. So we either have to apply some kind of protection, some kind of a chemical. Imidacloprid is one that is very often used. Or I can plant my pumpkin in February when there's relatively few whitefly, and grow it and protect this early season freeze, and I grow it in February, March, April, first part of May, just before the whiteflies start to show up in force. I harvest my pumpkins. And then I put them in a cold storage, and then when it's time to carve, I bring out the pumpkin and I do my holiday thing with it. Yes, but Rick, we go out to all these farms on Halloween and they have pumpkins laying around. Yes, that's true. You can go out and harvest the pumpkins. They've either used imidacloprid if they've got or some other of its relatives, if they are actually growing pumpkin plants, or most commonly you'll find pumpkins set out in a cornfield, which is not susceptible to whitefly feeding. They brought the pumpkins in from some other place and arranged them nicely in the corn maze. I can plant at a time when environmental conditions do not favor the disease. I can use disease-free stock, make sure that what I bring home to the nursery is in good health, and I can modify my cultural practices to avoid the disease. Exclusion, I'm going to inspect stock for signs of disease and reject or treat any which is suspect. I'm going to exclude it. I'm not going to bring it in. Yeah, I'm kind of avoiding it, but this is even a little bit more rigorous. Sometimes we exclude diseases from coming into Arizona through the inspections at the state line. Yes?
Prior under, what's the modified cultural practices? What would be an example?
Of which one?
The slide before, the modified cultural practices.
Modified cultural practices. Let me back up to that slide. Oh, wrong way. Modified cultural practices to avoid the disease. Let me see if I can come up with a good example. If I have a garden full of watermelon plants, and I have a watermelon plant that starts to get all crinkly, showing a virus disease, like a curly top virus in tomatoes, or watermelon mosaic virus. And I've only got one plant, and it's in the middle of the season. Instead of leaving that plant there, I might just go in and cut that plant out, haul it to the trash, and get rid of it, so that I modify the cultural ability of those insects. Usually it's insect aphid, usually, ones that take a virus from one plant to another. I can avoid having anything that those insects can pick up. I modify my growing process to avoid that disease. Thank you, appreciate that question. Plant quarantines are designed to exclude certain pests and diseases that are from areas that are free of the pest. We are watching very carefully for insects. It's usually more insects in this than others. We're watching very carefully at the borders for signs of the pecan weevil or the pecan case bear. They're in New Mexico. They haven't come to Arizona yet, and we're watching them very carefully. We don't bring a lot of trees into Arizona from the east because of the potential of bringing those insects across the desert and into Arizona. If we see a particular disease starting to happen, we may remove the tree. Pecan leaf scorch showed up in Cochise County last year, and we've been watching very carefully. It usually is a bacterial disease. Been watching those trees very carefully. And if there's a real problem, the producer will just go in and take out the tree and start over again. That spot. Eliminate carrier insects. I can cut way down on curly top and virus diseases if I eliminate the carrier insects. We talked earlier about the brown citrus aphid in Florida and the concern that it would carry the Tristeza virus. Because the brown citrus aphid never arrived in Arizona, the ability to vector that virus disease is almost minimal. We don't worry about it because the brown citrus aphid never got here. On the other hand, citrus greening, which is a bacterial disease carried by the Asian citrus psyllid, which is another sucking mouthpart insect, that psyllid has arrived in Arizona. It's probably here in Santan Valley, although we haven't really seen evidence of it yet. It's in the West Valley in Phoenix, it's in Tucson, Nogales, Yuma, up and down the Colorado River, western parts of Pinal County. They found one or two of these psyllid. They are aggressive at trying to take care of it, keep it out. But fortunately, the disease organism hasn't made it to the United States yet. We may have the insect, they're just not carrying the disease. So if I eliminate the carrier insects or keep them down to a level that is going to minimize the spread of disease, I've solved the problem. Eradication is much more difficult to do. That's when we immediately get on the problem and we eliminate it completely from being in a particular geographic area. And these are all examples of how I might be able to eradicate a particular insect or disease. Crop rotation is probably the most important thing I can do because many of the diseases are host-specific. They only affect a certain range, and sometimes it's only one species. So if I'm rotating out, then I can solve the problem. A common example would be the carnal bunt disease, Karnal bunt. Blew in from Mexico probably 15 years ago, and that was found in a wheat field in central Pinal County. And that caused all kinds of consternation as people began to try to eradicate that disease so that it didn't spread. It's one that causes the kernel, individual kernel to mildew inside, changes its color, gives it kind of a fishy smell to it, and nobody likes to eat bread that's got kernel bun in it. So they came in and they destroyed the diseased plants in the fields, just plowed them under, and went into other types of plants significantly. Went back to cotton, went to alfalfa, other plants that don't get the disease to reduce the inoculum. Sometimes we can fumigate, drench, or even solarize soils to reduce the disease organism. And we've got to remember again that complete and permanent eradication will probably not be possible, especially if the disease or insect gets a toehold in our area. Yes, please.
As far as rotating, did you find that just one season is enough to rotate, the other plant back?
That's a great question. The question is, do we find that one season is sufficient? And the answer is maybe, but probably not. But just one season is going to significantly reduce the population of the inoculum. Unless it's just a really vibrant disease, a lot of these organisms tend to break down over time if they are not able to complete their cycle. So, for example, when we're dealing with the carnal bunt example that I used before in wheat, just one season of going to cotton and avoiding planting a susceptible host has been able to really significantly reduce. In fact, I don't know the last time that we've seen an infestation in a particular field because of those. But 2 years or 3 years probably is a good thing if we can do that. Absolutely. Please.
Would you have to plant something when you're rotating, like, for example, wheat's a cereal grain? So would you, if you planted oats, would that help? Or would you have to go completely away from a cereal grain?
Generally, I have to go away from cereal grains completely, but we have to know that if that particular crop is susceptible, then we stay away from it. If it's not susceptible, then it's okay. Now, I've never heard of carnal bun and oats, so oats would be probably something that we could go to. But any of the wheats, both red, hard red, and the dough types, we would have to stay away from. Barley, I think, also is susceptible. Great question. If I'm going to protect a plant from a disease, then this is where the sprays and the dust come in. Again, I can modify the cultural practices or the environment that was going to help. And I can control those carrier insects, again, if I'm going to try to protect the plant. I can do those kinds of things. But sprays and dust usually are the ways that we are most familiar with. I'm here to tell you that control of a particular pest is usually going to take a program of various kinds of things. We just can't rely on a spray. We've also got to probably rely on cultural control also in order so that they can work together synergetically. For example, in a weed example, what we're dealing with now is Palmer's amaranth that is resistant to glyphosate, herbicide. Sometimes it's called Roundup, but there are a number of different products that have glyphosate in it. It's become resistant to it. You spray it on and it doesn't affect the plant at all. So in that case, what we need to do is put a hoe crew there and cut them out. I haven't found a single plant yet that is resistant to a good chopping hoe. Works every time. And one of the problems that we have when we try to protect plants is that we get so focused on one way that we don't bring in. If we had combined a chopping hoe along with the sprays, you know, you come in and you spray and it kills a certain population, and you come behind that with a hoe crew, then you take out what anything's left, then we don't get the resistance problem. And why is that beneficial? Because I've got two different control mechanisms. And it probably is going to be cheaper in the long run, because if I do run into resistance and I can't use the sprays anymore, then I'm going to add the number of times I'm going to have to drag a cultivator through the field and the number of times that I'm going to have to pay for a hoe crew. So we need to have a program. We need to look at various types of control protecting mechanisms. Please.
I was visiting with a gentleman last night whose family for generations has grown crops in Pennsylvania for sale. And they tried doing, because it's Pennsylvania, they tried to do a greenhouse during the winter to try to get another crop. But he said one of their problems with, say, insects is because, you know, insects could also holiday in there. But they had already used, you can only use those pesticides so many times a year. There's laws about that. So they then couldn't use it inside. Plus with the greenhouse, you know, it stays in there. So there were some pests that they just could not get rid of.
Yes.
And, you know, then you just have to stop doing it.
Just have to stop doing it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's important, I think, to realize that sometimes these insect pests, and diseases for that matter, when they're in a wonderful environment, and it's a continual cycle through the year, sometimes they just proliferate. So we'll see a lot of different types of mechanisms in greenhouses across the country to carry crops further into the fall and earlier in the spring. Sometimes they will put up a yellow sticky trap at various places through that attracts the aphids, attracts the psyllids. They're attracted to that color. And when they come to that color, some people will take a yellow plastic bucket and coat it with motor oil. Same kind of a thing. They are attracted to that, and it reduces, doesn't eliminate, doesn't eradicate, but it reduces the population so that other types of protectant materials will be able to affect. So, and sometimes we just have to deal, you know, I'm going to have to accept that there's going to be some damage from these things. So a multitude, a program, is what I'm advocating for disease, insect, and weed control. Resistance, which we've talked about quite a bit, using resistant varieties when possible. That's why when I buy tomato plants to set out, I'm looking at the tag for the abbreviation, the three-letter abbreviation VWR on the tag, VWR. Verticillium wilt resistant tomatoes. So I don't get the problem of verticillium wilt in my tomatoes. I use resistant varieties whenever I can. I'm going to enhance a plant's resistance by properly growing the crop. A healthy plant that is cooking along to the best of its genetic capacity is going to be a lot harder for a disease to take down or an insect to take down than one that is struggling. Doesn't have enough water, doesn't have enough nutrients, doesn't have enough air in the root, around the roots, etc., etc., etc. And finally, therapy, which is probably the most difficult of all to do. Therapy means I'm going to remove the diseased parts of an affected plant. I'm going to do surgery. I'm going to do surgery. Or I'm going to treat a diseased plant with heat or with chemicals. I'm going to apply something. I'm going to do something. So when we deal with the problems of mistletoe, for example, this is a mesquite branch. This is the outer end. This is the one that's closest to the trunk. You'll notice the difference in the diameter. Difference in the diameter of the two branches on either side. And then this swelled area, this swollen area, which is a symptom. It's the response of the plant to the feeding structures of the mistletoe. We call them haustoria. H-A-U-S-T-O-R-I-A, haustoria. And once they get down inside the stem, they cause this swelling, which anytime there's a swelling of this nature, it makes it hard to get water and nutrients past the blockage. So what some people will do to solve a mistletoe problem will be to just cut off the branch, remove it. If it's a smaller branch. If it's a larger branch and they catch it early enough, they may try to cut the mistletoe out, including the haustoria, so that they get rid of it, get rid of the plant. Once it gets to this stage, you'll notice that these little stubs of the mistletoe branch are all the way around. Pretty tough to do. Pretty tough to do. So therapy, including surgery, may be relatively difficult to do, but it's a possibility if we get it early enough. So next phase we're going to go through is we're going to go through some of the common diseases in Arizona. We'll do that after we take a break. I'm going to entertain questions right now.
You think we skip sanitation?
Sanitation. I missed sanitation, did I? Uh-oh. Well, sanitation is a great tool to use. And sanitation is where we clean up any diseased materials around the plant. For example, if we're in an agricultural crop or in a garden, we may just till all of the material back into the ground and allow it to break down. We allow it to break down. Or if I've got diseased fruit laying on the ground, I pick it up and dispose of it. I keep the weeds down in my garden so that there are no alternate hosts for insects to be attracted to, or to hide insects. If I have a lot of weeds around my garden, there's a place for the insects to hide and invade my garden. So sanitation is a really good way to reduce the capacity for diseases. Thank you for catching that. Please.
Do you clean your, like your pruning shears and things to prevent that too?
I like to clean my pruning shears and my pruning equipment in between plants. I may not change it from while I'm working on one plant. I may not disinfect while I'm working on one tree. But when I go to the next tree, I absolutely do clean them off.
What do you
Absolutely. So I don't take the disease from one tree to the other. That's the problem with the oleander gall problem. We usually prune hedges with a pruning shears, and we just kind of run along the top from one plant to the next. And that's how it gets spread oftentimes, is with a hedge shear going from an infected plant to a healthy plant. And it's very difficult, you see, to stop here, because in a hedge the branches mix. It becomes very difficult, and that's why oleander gall becomes a problem.
What do you use to clean them with?
I like to use a bleach solution, 1 part bleach to 9 parts water of any standard chlorine bleach. Works really good as a disinfectant. I don't use straight bleach. I use a 1 to 10 ratio.
Why is that? I mean, straight bleach would be bad for the plant or
Well,
the eyes?
the question is why not use a straight bleach? And the answer to that is you could, but it's very expensive because now you've got, plus when you're using that material, it is, you're always going to get some drips, and chlorine is a nutrient, but is also a salt. And when you have extra chlorine that you're putting into the environment, it could enhance the salt problem that we have. So I like to use a diluted form. It works better and it's less hazardous to use. Yes, please.
That's exactly how you do it. Do you spray it in a bottle? Do you have a bucket you poke it in? You have a rag, you wipe it off?
You can do that. Any one of those. If you use the rag, use a plastic glove. If you're going to spray it on there, make sure you don't breathe it. I like to use a dip myself. I'll just dip them. But in a long cutter blade on a head shear, I may have to just rub it down with another thing to use would be an alcohol swab pad, alcohol pad. That works good too. Please.
What about hydrogen peroxide?
Hydrogen peroxide would work well. I've never used it and I've never seen it recommended. I'm assuming it would probably work, but I don't think it's going to work as good as a bleach or an alcohol.
I usually use it on roses.
Yeah. Hydrogen peroxide is good for a lot of things, but I've never seen it used for sterilizing pruning equipment. All right, today we're going to finish up by talking about some of the examples of common diseases that we have. In parasitic plants, we've talked about mistletoe as a common problem. There are several different types. This one is a leafy type. Usually grows a little bit higher elevations than where we're at, although it's not uncommon to find them, say, in cottonwood trees. But we don't have a lot of cottonwood trees anymore since we've covered the ditches and there's not a lot of water for them. So we don't see this particular one more. It's more common up in the upper regions of the Gila River, in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. This is the type that is commonly used for an obscure social interaction event around the nativity. Not that I've ever done any of that.
Yeah.
It is a parasitic seed plant. Phorодendron is the genus, and it is called the leafy or true mistletoe. There's also, more commonly in the desert mistletoe, which does not have the leaves. It's usually long, slender stems. We see it commonly in mesquites and in palo verdes, ironwoods, and other desert plants. This is a palo verde branch that has had the mistletoe infection scraped out. You can see the damage that it does to the interior of the branch. And you begin to wonder how strong that particular joint is. Sometimes people will actually take out the entire branch. And we take it, and you don't just tug it off, you bring it back to its point of attachment.
I've got one on my property.
This is a particular problem that we see frequently, which is dodder, D-O-D-D-E-R. Here it is growing on top and in association with a creosote bush. Dodder is an infectious plant that gets all of its water and all of its nutrients off of the host plant. You'll notice that it has kind of a yellowish color to it, a kind of a blonde color, not green like the mistletoes. And the reason for that is it has no chlorophyll. It does not photosynthesize. It takes all of it. It is a flowering plant. It produces seeds, but it takes all of its strength from its host plant. And yes, it can be a challenge for that plant. It can be a problem. Here's a close-up of the structures that invade the host plant material. Here's the host plant stem. Here's the stem of the daughter plant. Here are the connections growing down and penetrating into the stem of the host plant. Here is a flower, produces the seeds. It's a very brittle connection. It's very easy to go and pull those out. You can pull them out. Very brittle. But the problem is that there's still buds here and it grows back. The only solution that we've been able to find for daughter is to take out the host plant, just remove it. It's because it can infest so many different types of plants. So mistletoe and daughter are the two most common parasitic plants that we deal with in the landscapes. Please.
Would you have to take out the whole plant or just the infected parts?
You could try pruning out the infested parts and having it come back from the
Is it like, it's systemic where it would go through the whole plant?
I don't think it's down in the roots. I think it's more of a physical attachment, so you could try doing that. But I'd watch it real careful. This is a disease called slime flux. We see it most commonly in mesquite trees. It'll be a black ooze that runs down the trunk, down onto the ground. We're not exactly sure what causes that. It could be a bacteria or possibly a yeast fungus. But its real problem in landscapes is when it stains or makes sticky the walkways, and you walk through it and you track it onto a white carpet, and pretty soon we got all kinds of problems. So there's no real solution except to keep it clean underneath the tree. I've seen trees live for decades with black ooze flowing down its trunk. Slime flux. This is a disease called ash decline, where the ash tree turns brown, the leaves look like they're dead, but at different times of the year, they'll actually green back up again. They're still alive. Cut into the branch to see, scrape the bark on the branch to see if it's green and moist underneath, or whether it's dry and brown. If it's dry and brown, it's dead. Prune it off. If it's green and moist, give it some time and see if it greens back up again. All right, this is a disease called crown gall. This is an apricot tree, and it's growing in a yard here that is receiving plenty of water, yet we're seeing a drought symptom. We can see through the canopy of the trees to the house behind it. Here's an example of a crown gall disease. It causes these galls on the roots and at the crown. And it's hard to get water and nutrients in through that process. It's a bacterial disease that goes in through wounds, usually through a graft union is a great example. If the graft union is too close to the ground, the bacteria gets into it and infests the plant. Crown gall. Here's another example of crown gall and how it infests the stem, the trunk.
So does that tree need to be removed?
This is, I'm sorry?
Would that tree need to be removed, or is there
Probably,
some?
eventually. This is frost damage. The brown on the tips of the stems is and it only happens in the wintertime, of course. If it happens in the summertime, you have to look for another reason, right? We're not going to get any frost damage at 120-degree temperature. But typically what will happen is that we'll get the outside edge of the tip of the branch that will die back. And because it looks so messy, people oftentimes will come in and cut those off. And then the next night, there will be another freeze, so the new tissue. So we typically just kind of leave it until we get past the freeze frost problem, and then come in and clean it up. I know it looks tacky, but it beats trying to keep pruning back and getting more and more and more damage. The tips give a little bit of protection to the tissue underneath. Okay, what is this one?
Oleander gall.
Oleander gall. It's called by Pseudomonas bacterium that causes that particular symptom. All right, this is a disease that is common in citrus and in mulberries and other soft tissued trees. Typically, we'll see it on the trunk, sometimes on the scaffold branches. The bark will become papery thin and begin to peel, and underneath the peeling bark will be black soot. It comes off on your fingers, it looks like soot off of a fireplace. The disease, for that reason, is called sooty canker. It is a fungal disease. Hendersonula is the genus of that particular fungus. Sunburned trees seem to have it the most common. Citrus, mulberries, sometimes ash are very susceptible to sunburn and to sooty canker. All right, and now we get down to the Phytophthora. These are the one-celled fungi, live in the soil. We call them the root rot fungi. In this particular plant, we have a black oozing lesion. We have fried roots, and we have peeling bark. Bark dies back. And we call this citrus foot rot. Crown rot or foot rot of citrus. It's very common. Very common. It was particularly common a couple of, about 10 years ago when we had the Tristeza virus scare. When the brown citrus aphid arrived in Florida, everybody across the citrus belt freaked out. We started searching for different rootstocks because the sour orange rootstock is resistant to foot rot. But the other disease, the other rootstock that we used that they were starting to graft onto is very susceptible. Rough lemon, for example, is a good rootstock. It produces vigorous trees and large fruit, but it is very susceptible to foot rot. The foot rot diseases, and the typical symptom will be when the outside bark melts away. This is exactly how this sample came in. The outside bark had melted away. Here's the bud union. Okay, and here is, and right close to the crown, the tree. Looks like the soil level it was planted right down into the soil. That bud union scar is a good way for things to get in. But you'll notice that when I pass this, when you see this, that there's very little bark left on the roots of this tree. This is all xylem tissue. Now the bark and the phloem and the cambium are gone. That's why the tree died. Fortunately, the brown citrus aphid has not come to Arizona, and we've kind of taken a deep breath and we're back grafting to sour orange rootstock. That's why it's important to know the rootstocks. When Glenn Wright is here in a couple of weeks, he'll talk about rootstocks for citrus. But this is a particular example of foot rot and the damage that it can do. Too wet soils, overwatering, wrong rootstock varieties can cause a problem. Here's another problem that is sometimes we see. That's when we plant, we kink that taproot. The taproot gets kinked. And again, it's very difficult to get water and nutrients through that transition. So we try not to kink the roots. Phytophthora foot rot.
At the beginning of this class, I wrote down citrus resistant to cotton root rot.
Correct.
So is that different than this?
That's different from this.
Okay,
It's coming up.
All right.
It's a first cousin to this. Citrus is very susceptible to foot rot, at least some varieties. But cotton root rot is a different animal. Please.
I have a question. I'm just curious. Under this city canker fungal disease, is that why they paint the trees black?
Yes, white.
White? Okay,
We
I've
will,
seen them painted
to
different
reflect the sunlight, we will paint the trunks white. Citrus, for example, it has bark that is very sensitive to sunburn. And you'll notice that the growth habit of citrus is to grow down close to the ground. That's to shade itself. It knows that its genetic capacity is that I'm going to shade myself to prevent that kind of damage. But we as humans come up because we want to sit under the tree, we prune it up for some reason, and then the sun will attack that susceptible bark. Usually we see sunburn problems on the southwest side of the tree, where the sun exposure is the greatest. So to solve that problem, we will paint the trunk white to reflect the sunlight and reflect the heat. It's not just a problem of summer either, because in our warm winters, sunlight hitting the bark may cause the saps to flow earlier. The tree goes dormant during the cold times. But when the bark warms up, it may wake up a little bit and then it becomes even more susceptible to the cold. And so we will also see that kind of problem in the winter time. So we paint the trunk white to reflect the heat and protect
With
it.
any type of paint?
I like to use latex white, cheapest I can find.
But diluted though, right?
I'm sorry?
Don't you dilute it some?
It can be diluted, absolutely. Half and half with water or even more. All we need is the coloration. We can dilute it with paint. That some people will use trade whitewash, which is a little bit more expensive. I just make sure that I use, latex, water-based, cheap as I can find, cut it with water, and it gets the job done. Don't use oil-based, because that'll damage the trunk.
What about wrapping it in the white fabric?
Anything that would protect it would be good. Some people use straw, some people use newspaper, some people put cardboard around there. But straw and cardboard and newspaper always seems to blow away, or it gets wet, or it degrades, and we have to make sure that we stay on top of it.
And Greenfield Nursery said the same thing you said first, was to let the branches just go down and protect itself. They were recommending.
Yeah. Don't cut the branches up. That's what my preference is.
Yeah, I bought 2 trees at the beginning of the spring, and they had cardboard around. They said, don't take this off.
Yeah, that's exactly why. The cardboard is a good way to do that, but eventually it breaks down in the sun, it gets wet, it
My
starts...
goats ate it.
Yeah. So the long-term solution is just to paint those trunks white. Some people, think that, well, that's just decoration, and so they paint everything white. They'll paint mesquites, and they'll paint olive trees, and they'll paint this, and no, it's just, the purpose is to protect these susceptible trees while they are susceptible.
And is it usually just when they're young, like the first couple of years, or?
Yeah, until that canopy gets down.
Yeah, because the canopy goes down.
But if I prune the canopy up, even if they're 20, 30 years old, I'm going to paint that trunk or I'm going to have problems.
One of the reasons that they do that is they plant them where there's grass, and the landscapers with the riding mowers, they can't get under it when the leaves, when the limbs come down, so they raise it and then they paint the trunks white. That's one of the reasons.
That's another reason, absolutely. You bet. That kind of answer the question? If I talk through a foot rot of citrus, it's very common, way too common. Overwatering is usually a major contributor to that. This is a nematode tree, affected tree. It's one of several in line. You'll notice the one over here is pretty good shape, and so is this one over here, but this one has yellow, stunted. We've got dieback, and it's caused by a nematode. A nematode is a small, microscopic roundworm, not a segmented worm like an earthworm. It's a roundworm, totally different type of animal. Microscopic, you can't see them with the naked eye. You have to look at them underneath a microscope to find them. There are those that live outside the plant and attack it from the outside. And there are those that become embedded inside the plant and attack it from the inside. The root knot nematode is the most common that we have. This one is the citrus nematode, and it affects citrus trees. And the root knot nematode, on the other hand, is one that lives in the soil. These oftentimes live in the air. They'll crawl on the trunk and affect it. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of those in Arizona. The root knot nematode seems to be the one that we see most often. They're small enough that you can't see them with your naked eye, but they are large enough that they don't fit in the soil pores of clays and silt soils. They almost always see them in sandy soil. So if you've got a sandy texture in your yard, you may have a nematode problem. The symptom of root knot nematode is where the roots swell. You look at the roots on tomatoes or other susceptible plants, and the roots swell. There's big old knots on them. And the adult male and the adult female do their mating outside of the plant, and then it's the female that goes inside the plant, inside the roots, and begins to reproduce. With a good spotting microscope and making a cross section and putting it in the microscope stage, oftentimes you'll be able to see the white, translucent, round-shaped females inside the roots. If you're careful, you can actually take a probe and you can pop them out of there. And if you put them in a petri dish, you can roll them around under the microscope again, because you can't see it with your naked eye, right? You have to do all this. I've often thought that a plant pathologist could take, remember those kind of games where they had beads and they roll over? I thought maybe, a plant pathology, but there's probably not enough people with microscopes to make that pay off. But you can roll them around. They're kind of fun to watch. Nematodes, sandy soils. Soil solarization is our best solution.
Is that curable, or is that take the tree out?
Yes, if we could kill the nematodes, it would, and take the pressure off that tree, it would respond. But usually at this stage of the game, sometimes it's best to, there's no real treatment other than soil solarization. They've taken a lot of the good materials that worked well, I'm not saying they're good, a lot of materials that worked well for nematodes, it required soil fumigation, and the materials were very toxic, and it could only be done by a licensed operator, and if it's not done correctly in a neighborhood, you end up with all kinds of non-target deaths, so that it's not labeled anymore for use.
So if you remove the citrus tree and plant another citrus tree, tree in there, the next one will become infected.
It's possible, but you'll see that the trees on either side of it are all right.
Right.
So it depends, I could have to do a complete site analysis. What's the texture of the soil between the two trees? And is this a new infestation, or is this something that's going to move with time? You know, there needs to be some history to it.
And can you define the soil solarization?
Sure.
You do.
Soil solarization is a technique that is used to control insect, weed, and nematode problems in a given area. I don't have any really good slides for soil solarization, but typically what we would do, if this was going to be the area that we were going to treat, we would soak it really good. Just soak it all the way down 3 feet if we could. And then a heavy mill, clear plastic, spread out over the top, seal it around the edges with soil, and let the soil cook. It works best in late May, June, and July for obvious reasons because the sun is directly overhead. Doesn't work quite so well when the sun angle is more oblique during the winter months.
And how long would you have to leave that on?
6 to 8 weeks is what I usually allow it to do. That's what I usually recommend. It could be done shorter, it could be gone longer, but it only is going to heat the soil to about 6 inches. And below 6 inches, we don't seem to get the temperature. So any of the weed seeds, any of the insects, any of the nematodes that are below 6 inches in depth are going to be relatively unaffected. But I've got 6 inches that I can work with for 1 or 2 seasons.
So black is incorrect. I've seen trees painted black. That's incorrect, right? On the roots. I'm going back to that. I want to get this straight in my mind.
I can't think of any reason for a biological reason, a science-based reason to paint a trunk with black.
Okay. And then I've seen solarization done with black. And I've heard you say below clear is the correct way to do it.
I think the clear heats deeper, faster than the black. Black tends to be a little cooler.
Oh, okay. I just want to get that clear in my mind because I've seen both of them and I want to know the right way to do it.
Sure.
You would think the
Yeah.
black,
The black plastic tends to increase the warmth in a cold environment just to get those plants started and protect them.
Okay.
It's the clear that I think heats deeper.
I've seen black, like
Yeah.
tar or something
Yes.
in your pine trees
Yeah.
that are getting rid of, they've got a wound and the sap's coming out and they'll put like a
like
black
pitch.
tar
It's
pitch
Yeah,
or
it's like a
something
pitch.
around
Yeah.
Oh,
stop
okay.
that sap.
Yeah.
So it's
In the
not,
colder
so we're
climate.
not talking
Colder
about
climate.
paint.
Yeah.
No, it's like a pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of that drainage that usually coming from wounds.
Right,
Oh, okay.
right.
So that's a wounded tree.
And I used to see that up north a lot, in
Yeah.
colder weather.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of the black, even in community gardens, you know, where they solarize it in the big black heavy plastic. And I just want to get it right in my mind, which is the most effective and why some people do it this way and some people do it that way.
As far as solarization is concerned, all of the research that I've seen, they've implied that we should use the clear plastic over the black.
Okay. Thank you.
There's been a lot of work with modifying environments using various colors of mulches, plastic mulches. Now, there's reds and there's whites and there's blacks and there's tans and there's clear. And each one of those will radiate a certain amount of temperature based on the color. Thank you. Appreciate the help. All right, here's the alternaria on navel oranges that I mentioned earlier. It is a fungus disease, and we usually see it on navels because that navel end has an indentation that allows these spores to get back up into that indentation, and they find a really acceptable environment. They like that environment. And the spores tend to germinate, and we see the disease incident more in maples than we do in other citrus. It'll start with just a little soft spot. Eventually, it could cover the entire fruit. And they typically will fall off onto the ground and then lay underneath there, and then as the disease continues, they sporulate. The spores come up into the canopy of the tree, and we see a cycle going. So good sanitation is very important, very important.
Does that immediately make that fruit unedible? Or
Yeah, it's
cut
pretty,
off?
it doesn't taste very good. Yeah. You have to throw it out. Oh, you check your navels and see if you see any incidents of this. Now would be a good time of the year to check for them. This is powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is, again, a fungus that grows on the surface of the leaf. It only sends down its quote-unquote roots, down its tissue, its water-absorbing, nutrient-absorbing structures down into. I could come through and just rub that off. I could wipe that off with my fingers.
That's a grape leaf.
This is a grape leaf, correct. I can wipe this off with my fingers, but it will regrow from what's left down inside the tissue. So this is powdery mildew fungus. This is a grape leaf. It also grows on a number of other different types of plants. Very common in the spring. Doesn't like temperatures over 90 degrees. When the temperature hits 90 degrees, it shuts down. Pretty much. But when the temperature goes below 90 degrees and stays there consistently, like right now, it's more common. So from now until whenever it warms up in the spring, will be when we see powdery mildew. Yes, please.
Does it shut down or does it just go dormant? And will that come back?
Pretty much dies out. And then the grape leaves fall off. The deciduous leaves fall. It's a little bit more of a problem in evergreens like euonymus hedge. Very common with that kind of a problem. Euonymus. Roses have that problem. But when the leaves fall off, the disease falls off. And then it lies there on the dead leaves till the spring when the new leaves come out. So clean up around it really helps solve the problem. Powdery mildew. It is very susceptible to sulfur sprays. Sulfur sprays work very well against it. The only problem is that sulfur sprays tend to burn the leaves when the temperature goes up fairly high. So we run that problem, that risk. Can only use them during cool temperatures. A number of fungicides that will prevent these. You can find several products in the stores that will have powdery mildew on the label. So it's a relatively easy disease to control, as long as we're ahead of it. I had a friend who was managing Verde Grande vineyards in Saskatoon years ago. The vineyard's gone now, went out of business, but I often would ride through the fields with him, and one of the things he was doing was sniffing the air. He'd go with the window down. He said he could smell the fungus before he could see it. So he'd smell a smell that he was looking for and call the spray rig to come in and spray such and such block section. Because once that gets on the fruit, you can't sell it. And when you're managing your grape vineyard and you can't sell the fruit, how long do you have a job? Here's some grape berries with powdery mildew on those. They'll be scabbed, they'll be shrunken, they'll be shriveled, they'll be small, and it can be a real problem. Once it gets on the fruit, it's not sellable, it's not edible. So we have to keep an eye on it. All right, here's another Phytophthora disease. We see the leaves on the tree that are turning yellow. That's the symptom. It's a drought symptom that usually shows up first compared with the other trees around it. And it's very similar to the foot rot of citrus. Wet soils, especially wet clay soils, can be a real problem. This is verticillium wilt of olive. Verticillium wilt of olive is a fungus that lives in the soil, invades the roots in the wintertime. January or so is when it's most active. It clogs up the tubes, the water conducting tubes, so that a plant cannot get water from the roots up to the leaves. And when that happens, that affected branch dies out. If you look at the shade underneath the trees, the sun is relatively overhead. This is in June and July. This picture was taken. And the dead branches are showing up now in this particular orchard. They did not use a resistant rootstock. So there are in the garden and landscape plant palette an olive tree that can be planted anywhere to provide shade, to provide color, to provide strength, relatively low water use. It puts out no flowers, it's sterile, so it's not allergenic, which is why it can be planted. The most larger communities have outlawed olives because of their allergy issues. Phoenix and Tucson will not allow a regular olive to be planted anywhere in city limits because of the allergies. But this particular variety is sterile. And it is grafted onto a rootstock called oblonga. Oblonga rootstock. The oblonga rootstock is resistant to verticillium wilt of olive. So we have a sterile top and a resistant bottom, low water use, great looking tree, very little problems of any. It's a wonderful, I think, landscape tree. The problem is that the Swan Hill is proprietary. Somebody figured out how to do that and patented it, so nobody else can do it. So the cost is a little bit higher, but in my opinion, it's a wonderful landscape tree, solves a lot of the problems.
No.
There are sterile trees, non-fruiting olives, that are not grafted onto the oblonga, that are susceptible to verticillium wilt. And that could be a problem. So we have to make sure, if that's what we want, to make sure that we get the right variety. But as one branch dies here and a branch dies here, and we cut those out, eventually there's going to be so little left of the tree as we just cut the tree out.
Now, if you have a swan, I know I have two Swan Hill, and about a year ago, I had one branch that did that, but it was just one very small one.
On a Swan Hill?
Yeah, I don't know if it was that or some other reason, but it did exactly that. Here's this beautiful green canopy, right in the middle, I had just a small amount, and we just cut it off, and then it never came back. So.
If it did come back, I would say that it was probably something else, because verticillium wilt tends to come back year after year after year. But it could have been.
So.
That would be the first time I've heard that, if it was indeed verticillium. It's a soil-borne fungus, and olives is a real problem, but it's also on tomatoes. It's also on a lot of other different types. That's why we have verticillium wilt-resistant tomatoes, VWR tomatoes. This is heart rot. It's a fungal canker. It gets into the inside of the tree and it tends to rot out the center part of the tree. Here's a fruiting structure of one of those heart rot fungi here coming out of the tree. I passed around that one example earlier. This is Ganoderma, which is becoming more and more of a problem in Arizona. Fungal fruiting structures. They're beautiful, but they can be a challenge. This is Philostricta, which is pad spot on opuntia, pad spots. And they can be disheartening. It is a fungus disease. Once it's there, it's hard to get rid of. You're ever going to get rid of the damage. So we just come in and prune out that particular pad and try to fix the problem with sanitation. Here's another example. And then the cotton root rot. All right, so I need to tell you about cotton root rot. It is a very deadly disease. It kills hundreds of different types of plants. It's widespread. It can be a real problem. It is a disease of broadleaf trees only. Broadleaf trees only. Palm trees are not affected by it. It is a broadleaf, and it'll take out a lot of different species. Our desert-adapted native trees and shrubs seem to be a little bit more resistant than others. Okay. It kills the tree so fast that the leaves never get a chance to form an abscission layer, a layer of thin-walled cells that cause the leaf to fall off. You know, when you have the leaves shed on deciduous trees in the fall, it forms an abscission layer. It killed the tree so fast that the leaves cling onto the branch. Never has that chance to form an abscission layer. The tree like this, it can go from perfectly healthy to perfectly dead in a matter of 3 or 4 days. How fast it goes. And it tends to break down the outer structure of the roots. It tends to erode, kind of like our citrus foot rot. It erodes the bark on the roots so that those roots are not able to function. But in the Texas root rot or cotton root rot, it works very quickly, whereas in citrus foot rot, it's a relatively slow process. Why do we call it Texas or cotton root rot? We typically name a disease after the first place where we find it. In this case, it was first identified in Texas on a cotton plant. And we have cotton root rot all over Pinal County. It tends to be along the rivers, so along the farms, along the Gila River, we'll often see it. I saw it just a couple of miles south of here, coming up for class when the cotton was still growing. I would see it, spots in the field that died back, cotton root rot. Well, it's such a nasty customer that the people of Texas decided they did not want to be associated with it. So where we call it Texas root rot, they call it cotton root rot. And out of deference for the sensitivities of the people of Texas, I tend to use cotton root rot. You see, my mother's family was from Texas, and I'm very sensitive about the people and their feelings. I am, absolutely. So that's why I like to use cotton root rot. But oftentimes it will also be called Texas root rot. I'm just hoping that when this video goes online, that my associates in Texas who might see this will understand my true sensitivity for the issue and the situation.
Is it a fungus?
One of the ways that we tell whether we have cotton or Texas root rot is by looking at the fungus. It grows on the outside of the root. It doesn't go inside, it grows on the outside. So anytime we have strands of fungus growing on the outside of the root with typical symptoms, we will often, we pretty much know that that's what it is. That is a sign of the disease. Takes a hand lens or a microscope, but that is one of the things we look for. And this is the name, the scientific name. Pathology, omnivora. Omnivora because it eats everything. Vora means devour, omna means everything, so they call it omnivora. This is the new genus you'll find. Sometimes you'll find Phytophthora as the genus, and earlier, but they've changed the genus name to update it, and it is now Phytophthora. It is on the root of an infested tree. Here it is, looking at it under a compound microscope in a water environment, and we'll see this fungal strands coming out from the root and actually out in the environment around the root. Strands viewed using a compound microscope. This is the fruiting spore mat. The fungus comes out, creates the spores, fungi upon it. Here are the spores, and these are resting stages. These are very thick-walled stages that allows that disease to stay in the soil for maybe 100 years without effect. I was asked to help create and develop a training orchard on the Gila River Indian Reservation at their youth detention center. They want to reconnect their youth to their heritage, which is agricultural, as a means of helping them find themselves and their identity. It's a great plan. So we set up this demonstration orchard, and it had apples, and it had apricots, and it had peaches, and it had plums, all growing in a fairly large orchard. We helped lay it out, spec it in. You know, you've got to have them lined up. The holes have got to be lined up, not only up and down the row, but across at diagonals across the row, and also at right angles. You have them so they're all aligned. So you go in and you stake out and get them all, and then you dig the hole and then you plant the trees. We did a lot of that. We got the trees up, we got them growing. And I asked before, in the planting stage, has there ever been any Texas root rot in this area? It's right along the Gila River, 100 yards from the Gila River in Sackatoon. No, we never seen any of that. Okay, so we went and proceeded. Well, sure enough, that was there. It had been probably 80 years since there had been any plants planted in that place. And sure enough, the first tree, then it's kind of spreads out like this, spreads out from, you've got a center point and just goes out on a 360 degree and spreads out. Pretty soon that entire orchard was taken out. It was devastating. Another way to tell the Texas root rot, cotton root rot fungus is that it will have connections coming out at 90 degrees. Have one strand coming this way, it'll branch out at 90 degrees. They call it a cruciform structure. Cross-shaped hyphae. The hyphae are the individual strands of the fungus. Another spore mat here. You only see the spore mats when it's really humid and hot. Very rare do we see them, but every once in a while they'll show up. This is a spore mat where it reproduces. It comes out of the ground, forms the spore mat, makes the spores, and sometimes it'll make even the sclerotia, which carry it over. Here's another example of a tree here that is dead because of it. Here's another tree here that's affected, that's dying. Typically, when we see a dead tree that dies quickly and the leaves stay on the ground, stay on the tree, we pretty much know that we're dealing with cotton root rot.
Is there any
All right.
prevention?
I'm sorry?
Prevention steps for this, since it's such an awful deadly thing? Are there
Prevent it
prevention?
or
How do
get
you
rid of it?
prevent it? Or get rid of it?
To solve the problem? Yeah, there's not a whole lot we can do.
Like, there
So, okay.
So you can't do like the soil sanitation? That won't work?
So when you planted your orchard for the people up in Sacaton or in that area, if you would have known to have that, could you have not done anything?
I wouldn't have planted it.
You would have just said, no, that's not.
No way.
Yeah.
And we call that a bioassay. Bioassay, where we take a plant that's susceptible and plant it and see if there's any effect. So what we probably should have done is planted alfalfa in that field and see if it, because alfalfa is affected by it, or cotton, and see if there was going to be any response to it. And if we did, then don't put the orchard there, put it someplace else. Because once those trees are in place, and they're supposed to be there for 20 and 30, 40 years, it's a very expensive process to start over and do something else different. There's no way to run a sample to find out, a soil sample to find, unless you can find the sclerotia, but they're very hard to find and identify. So it's very difficult to tell root rot ground except by knowing that it's there. The Florence vineyards in Florence existed for a couple of, maybe 20, 30 years. But they were always fighting in their grapevines Texas root rot. There would always be vines that would be dying. And eventually they just took the vines out because it was more than they could handle. There's no fungicides that I know of that will solve it. Soil solarization doesn't work around perennial plants because it also cooks the roots. There is one incident where we were able to minimize the problem. It was a wine grape planting up east of Florence. Norm Conkle put in a winery up on the Box O' Wash, up on the hills, and he had a problem. But you see, with grapevines, they're drip irrigated, so the wetted area is relatively small, and the roots don't tend to grow into dry ground, so the root system is small. So what we did was to come in as soon as the symptoms, we did a demonstration, we cut off all the fruit, dropped all the fruit off the vine, the affected vine, and then we used steer manure, soil sulfur, and ammonium sulfate mixed together and irrigated in, which tend to lower the pH, because this particular disease likes alkaline soils. That's why we find it in the Southwest. That's why we find it in Texas. Why we find it in New Mexico. It's why we find it in Arizona, Colorado, and northern Mexico, because it's an alkaline environment. Don't find it in Georgia. That may be another reason my plant pathology friend went to someplace else. He got tired of dealing with Texas root rot, cotton root rot. None of those work, but if we can acidify the soil, bring the pH down to 7 or below, then it inactivates the diseases. It inactivates the disease. It doesn't like alkaline soils, but our soils are alkaline, right? So that's why we struggle with that process. By adding those three materials, we were able to acidify the soil and shut down the disease. Next year, that vine produced fruit. But when we go to a flood irrigated situation like the orchard in Sacaton, now I'm irrigating an entire border on either side of that plant. I've got the row here, I'm wetting on both sides, and those roots are wide and they're deep. We tried to acidify the soil using that process just around one tree. And I couldn't get it to happen because it was too much volume and not enough material put it on. And that's why we lost the vineyard. So small areas, yeah, we probably can manage it. If we do it quickly and appropriately. But on larger areas, I haven't been able to make it work. Yes, please.
Different topic. I have live oak trees, and then we have them in our neighborhood as well. And they drop these balls, I'll say, underneath the tree. I don't know if they come up from the ground or whatever, but they're a fungus of some sort.
Are you talking about the oak gall that comes from the roots out of the soil, or are you talking the fuzzy thing that's on the bottom of the leaves?
I think it's the thing that comes up from the roots. I find it on the ground.
Yes.
Underneath.
Yeah.
If I pick it up, it kind of spores off, I guess.
That's right.
So that's coming from the roots.
That is correct. That's the fruiting structure from the inside the plant. The oak trees seem to not be too bothered by it.
Yeah, that's what they say. You can just
I
pick
think
them
it's
up
just a
and-
matter of sanitation and
Okay.
seeing what happens. I wouldn't try to do anything else to the tree. Please.
Kind of related to that, I've noticed, I'm not sure what time of year, a mushroom that grows and stays closed for the most part, and then when you open it, it's all black and stuff.
It's kind of like a white fungus that grows out of the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a puffball.
Puffball.
A puffball. There are a number of different type of fungi. Puffballs are one of those. They're not pathogenic. They're just growing up out of the desert soils. They grow up and then they pop open and then the spores emit. They eject the spores in puffs.
Okay, so nothing to be concerned with.
Nothing to worry about.
Okay, thank you.
When I was in graduate school, I took a course in mycology, the study of fungi. And one of the things that I had to do to pass the course was to turn in a collection of fungi. And I got to know the different types of fungi. Just think about it. You have to turn in a collection of 100 separate fungi. What a challenge. I mean, you know, I passed the course, but it was a full-time job finding these fungi. Compared to a herpetology course that I took, study of reptiles, it's much easier to collect fungi because they don't run around like lizards. I never could get the lizard collection. They were just faster than I could move. Before I met my current wife, I want to make that clear. I invited a young lady from Tucson to go with me collecting fungi. So we went up on Mount Lemon and we took a picnic lunch and we had a delightful time. And I would roll over the dead logs looking for this fungus or that fungus, and I'd collect it, put it in my collection. That's how we got the thing done, right? And that was a very good day that day. I have to tell you, it was a good day.
For her.
It was a good collecting day.
Did you get another date after?
Well, I thought I was going to be all right. I took her home, and it was very pleasant, and I thought, well, maybe, you know, I'll get another chance here. Next time I saw her at school, it was ice cold. She'd walked in the front door and her brother was there. And she said, "Where have you been?" "Well, I've been up with Rick on Mount Lemon collecting fungus." And he said, "Yeah, sure you were." She couldn't collect. So, I mean, it's hard to use collecting fungus as a reality check for on a date. Most people don't do those kinds of things. So it's probably just for the best. I'm sure she's much happier with a doctor or whoever she married, and I certainly am I'm very happy with Lexi Lynn and our choices. But these kinds of things do impact your social life. Let's finish up by talking about some other diseases. This is, again, root knot nematode. Here are the knots on the carrot. Each one of these galls are filled with the female nematode. This is Melvoin and Covita, the root knot nematode. And it can be nasty. Nobody wants to eat a carrot that's got a bunch of worms in it.
You get your protein with your vegetables.
Now, see, that would be something that I would say, eating protein with your carbohydrates. Here's a close look at these knots on the roots. And again, you cut through those and put them under a microscope, and you can actually see the nematodes. They're fascinating animals. But they can be devastating to plants. Root knot nematode galls. Here we have powdery mildew, again on cantaloupe. Yeah, I don't know why we got grape on there, I need to fix that. But this is a cantaloupe leaf, powdery mildew. And this is curly top virus on tomato. We get a yellow stunted vine, and a lot of times the leaf will invert themselves and curl up. And it's a very significant issue. If I'm seeing this kind of symptom early in the season, I may come in and take that plant out just to get rid of it. But later in the season, where I've got a lot of those, I might just leave it because I'm going to terminate the crop anyway. Get as much fruit off of it as I can. Doesn't affect the fruit too much. And get as much fruit off as I can, and call it good. Curly top on tomatoes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about virus. Viruses are small, tiny, microscopic, sheath encapsulated segments of DNA, of genetic material. The genetic material inside is in that virus sheath. It's like kind of like a time-lapsed capsule that we take, and it slowly dissolves over time, and we get a long-term. The capsule dissolves, releases all the goodies inside, and it goes from there. And as those goodies replicate themselves inside the host, then the disease builds. And they will cause a number of different symptoms. Yellowing is usually one of those, but it is different from the symptom that is caused by iron deficiency. Iron deficiency has leaves that are turning yellow, but the veins themselves stay green. The veins stay green, and it's almost always on new tissue, new leaves. In a virus, the yellow goes across the veins. We call that symptom a mottle symptom, M-O-T-T-L-E, mottle symptom, where we get a lot of different types of coloration. I thought I had. This is a curly top virus on a pepper plant. And the symptoms where, again, it's rolling, it's got a yellow, but the yellow goes across the veins, it tends to curl up and stunt the plant. Here's an infected versus a healthy plant. How soon will this one become infected? Depends on how many insects are migrating from the diseased plant to the healthy plant. This is watermelon mosaic I mentioned before, where we get all crinkly. Here's the watermelon, you can see it. They place it underneath the vines to protect it from sunburn. So they'll take the developing melon and put it and pile the vines to shade it. Whenever we start seeing this crinkly symptom, is an indication of this mosaic virus. And again, if it's early season, I might roll it out. But if it's widespread and towards the end of the season, I'm just going to get as many melons off as I can and go for it. Here's the slide I was looking for, where it shows the yellow going across the veins. Some of the veins stay green, yes. Some of the veins stay green, but some of them are yellow. Iron chlorosis, all the veins will stay green. In a virus model, you'll see some of the veins turning yellow. Alfalfa mosaic virus in basil. Now, how does an alfalfa virus get into basil? Well, it's insect transferred, and this particular virus can affect a variety of different plants. But it was first found in alfalfa, so they call it alfalfa mosaic virus. All right, this is blossom end rot on tomatoes growing in a greenhouse, where the bottom end of the tomato turns a dark black or brown, becomes hard. We can actually come in and cut that blossom end damage off, and the tomato is perfectly edible. Some people think that it might be an environmental issue. Some people think it might be a calcium problem. We've never been able to figure it out and lessen the amount of damage. Variety seems to be important. Some varieties, it's more intense than others. But this is not an infectious disease. We don't think it's biological. We think it's environmental or nutritional. So the last slide here is that as we strive to begin diagnosing plant problems and this concept of disease, it's important to understand that the skills are important to us. We need to develop these observational skills. We need to be familiar with the broad range of diseases and insects that affect gardens and landscapes in the desert. And we need to start pulling all of those pieces together to make a complete picture. Once we have the complete picture, it's easier to make a diagnosis and make a decision that is correct. If I don't have all of the pieces, I may make a wrong decision. Please.
Do you have I don't know, it's a kind of a ladder that you would think, you know, that you could take an educated brain like yours and the thought process so that it would point out a list of questions for you? So I come and I say, okay, well, I have yellow leaves. And then I type in yellow leaves, and then it says, okay, so, and there's questions that you could answer, and then it would go to laddering down once you've answered those. Is there anything like that that exists, or?
Well, in human medicine, they would call that differential diagnoses, and there is some of that, but it's a little bit more complex because of the total different types of plants that we're dealing with, often side by side, some affected, some not, some, maybe it's all of them. But next week when we talk about diagnosis, I do have a process that I'm going to teach you how to do, how to use, and how to make good observations. And so I think when we get through next week's discussion, it'll make a lot more sense on this. Today I just wanted to introduce this process as we talk about plant diseases.